Okay, looks like we are kind of on the air. So thank you guys for joining us. It says it's live. And a couple of you are asking when we were going to be starting. We're starting now. So thank you guys for coming. Hopefully you can see that. If you have not seen it, a couple of you are still asking in the pod, why can't I see it? You may want to make sure you click play on the window in the player. So let me go type that really quickly on the page because I think a couple of people don't know that they have to do that. So let's just say on this page here, click the play button on the player above to launch the webcast. All right. Hopefully that will work for people and they'll be able to see. So there is a question and answer pod. If you guys have questions, you are welcome to type those also occasionally to the Google Plus page. There's supposed to be 3 of us this morning. One of them is still trying to log in, so we were hoping to give him a minute to do that, but hopefully Mark Morrow will be joining us in just a second. My name is Rich Harrington. I am the publisher of Photofocus.com, and we are joined by an insider today. We have got Ron Pepper from HDRsoft. Ron's also a photographer, and I'm going to let you give a little bit about your own background, Ron. So you ready to tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Yes, am I on? Is this
Yep,
thing
you
on?
are on.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ron. I'm San Francisco photographer for photography. I got into HDR as part of the panoramic process because those of us who shoot this way we're looking for this kind of a holy grail to fix the basic problem of there's always a bright area and always a too dark area in a 360-degree photo. So I've been into HDR since about 2004, I'd say, when it was still just a baby, and kind of watched it grow up to now being a really great photographic tool for solving that problem of the limitation of the dynamic range of your camera. So what I do with that is what I like to do is a lot of small business. My favorite things to shoot is hotels. I do other things, but it's usually kind of secondary to that kind of work.
Okay, very cool. And I use HDR as well for some of my specialty photography. I'm also into panoramic photography. I was just over shooting on the island of Curacao and was doing some landscapes and shooting some historical sites that were very low light. I did some of that earlier this year too in the Philippines. So I'm going to share some of those images with you from some exploration type photography. And then I'm getting ready to head out into the desert right after this hangout, actually, to do some shooting for some time lapse. And I'll often use 3-bracket HDR for my time lapse shooting as well, just to get enhanced dynamic range there. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different types of things here. A couple people are still saying, "Is this thing started?" So make sure that you folks, if you are struggling with that, click the play button. But if anybody could post in the question pod that you've seen it, we're definitely here. It says we're broadcasting and the viewer count keeps going up. So I'm hoping that some of you are hearing it. So feel free to post a question in the Q&A pod. I got somebody saying they got us, so good. All right, so
I
hopefully
guess
this works.
I guess while to do that, I got distracted, and I should say the whole thing about being an insider is that I've worked with HDRsoft for a few years now, who makes Photomatix. So I'm a photographer. I'm not an engineer or developer, but I'm just really involved with that, and I do some customer service things to helping photographers with question and answer about how to shoot and stuff like that. So that's where that insider came from.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, let's start there. The one of the things that pops up a lot with HDR is the actual shooting process. We'll talk about production and post production here, but I want to start on the shooting side. And Ron, one of the things you and I have talked about before on a Photofocus podcast, and I think it's worth exploring here, is people often say, "Well, how many shots do I need?" And you framed it quite well with a very vague answer initially that I thought you were just dodging. It depends, but it really does depend, and it depends upon the dynamic range of the scene, right? You don't want to capture more shots than you need because it just leads to extra work. But at the same time, capturing a landscape is going to take maybe 3 shots to get it really well versus, shooting the interior of a museum with a skylight and glass windows and shadowy areas might take 7 shots. talk a little bit about how you make that decision when you're putting together or designing the shot. How do you determine how many shots to get, and what's the maximum amount of difference with bracketing do you prefer to put between each of those shots?
Hmm. Well, the last question is kind of the easiest one to answer. I'd say the maximum spacing between shots you should do is 2. And again, being the photographer and not the engineer, I don't know the details of exactly why that is, but what I do know is that if you space them out more than about 2 EV apart, then that which is 2 stops apart, then you're not going to have enough information to really make a good 32-bit image. Where you can also, so you can do 1 EV as well. I see Mark came on now. So you can shoot 1 EV because a lot of times a lot of cameras only shoot 1 EV, but maximum of 2 is the answer.
Okay.
To go on about how many shots it takes.
Go ahead.
For a scene, you're right. Yeah, cut off. So yeah, the real important thing is to measure with your light meter the brightest areas and the darkest areas, and then capture that whole range. So you're right. As a general rule of thumb, a landscape a lot of times would only, well, a lot of landscapes you don't need HDR depending on the light and the situation. But there's a lot of times where the light might not be ideal, where you do want to space it. So you might only need 3 shots at 2 spacing. You might only need 3 shots at 1 spacing even. It all just depends on the dynamic range of the scene. So if you get into one of those really extreme situations, like you mentioned, interior of a museum where there's probably some really dark corners and there might be a skylight or a window, then the dynamic range might be so great that you might be taking 7 images at 2 spacing apart, and that's an extremely wide range. But if you want to get good results, that's the key, is to really shoot for the highlights, shoot for the shadows, and shoot everything in between at a maximum of 2 spacing.
Excellent. Well, 2 quick things. In just a moment, we're going to let Mark Morrow introduce himself. Mark is one of the team over at Photofocus. A couple people have complained about occasional issues on the bandwidth and everything else. We're doing the best we could here. I apologize, folks. Part of that's probably on me. I am traveling for a shoot today, and unfortunately, Marriott hotels don't seem to believe in broadband internet that is actually broadband internet. So I apologize for that if it's a little bit choppy, but we're going to be switching over to some screens here in a moment, which will take less bandwidth, so you should see a nice bump in the audio quality here in just a moment. Mark, why don't you tell folks just a little bit about your background and you're using HDR as well?
Sure, Rich, thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Just a tad echoey, but we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I'm traveling as well, and I'm working with a bit of a limited internet connection myself here at the beach in Corolla, North Carolina. I'm sorry, Rich, what was the question?
I was just asking how you use HDR in your photography.
Well, I use HDR almost all the time now. It's something that I'm relatively new to. I used to do these things manually, whether real estate photography or landscape photography, as yourself, Rich, and many Photoshop users out there are used to creating their own composites. But for a real estate workflow, I find the HDR, the Photomatix, the exposure fusion and tone mapping options within Photomatix to be as superior to what I've experienced with Photoshop. Not that there's anything wrong with Photoshop's HDR, but the batch routines, the way that it interacts with Bridge and Lightroom as well, for any user of the Photoshop platform, Photomatix is going to work very well. What I like to use it for, I like to use, I was telling Ron the other day that sometimes a real estate shoot, sometimes I'll have 6 real estate jobs in one day on a busy day. There's a lot of processing to be done there. The place that I really started using HDR in real estate was on the interior side, where I was having the UFO effect at the window level, as everyone else, and instead of having to try to blend these composites in and end up with an unrealistic looking line and contrast and tone between the two, Photomatix just makes short work of that. And when you can do single image exposure, it will create the I'm assuming, Ron, that it's creating the other images that are needed to create this to create this curve. You know, it really is amazing what Photomatix can do in a single swipe to one image. So when we're talking, you know, usually you put down a real estate job pretty well, but when you have a lot of images, you need to do these two. And even I'll do this before I even go through and make my final selection. Sometimes I'll batch routine the process in Photomatix. But I like to use to answer the question, Rich. I'm sorry, long-winded, but I use it all the time. I love to use it in my landscape work. I've learned in the past few weeks that I haven't even been doing it properly. I haven't been shooting it properly. I am practicing on it this weekend. In fact, trying to actually use the exposure calculator that Photomatix provides on their website in their Q&A section. We can provide links to these things, Rich, if possible, in the show notes.
But why don't you? Yeah, I'm going to have you do this, Mark. Why don't you make sure to do a blog post this week about that exposure calculator and what you've learned from shooting this weekend? I think that would be a good match. Now, I want to show one simple shot for everyone's benefit of sort of the bracketing, and then Ron, I'll toss over to you. Let me just share my screen here for 1 second. I just want to show you Bridge. So let me switch over, and can you guys see Adobe Bridge now?
Yes.
Okay, so what I just want to do here is sort of explain the logic, and this is a 5-shot. I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looks like I might be missing one, but that's okay. I think I was originally intending to do a 7, and I didn't need it, so I tossed away a 1 because it was pretty blown out. But this here is the sort of the base exposure, and when I shot this, I was inside of a hallway, and I decided to knock it down a little bit. So you see that I had my exposure compensation set to 1 below. And then we sort of go from there. So I was shooting, it was a really bright sun, and I was just compensating, and this is what the camera would have captured on its own. Then I set the bracketing up, and by underexposing, I was able to capture everything that was outside of this window. This allowed me to see the highlights. So by underexposing, I recovered all of the highlight areas far better than you could with the shadows or highlights recovery slider. And I always laugh. There's a lot of people that grumble about HDR or think it's a gimmick, yet they use the shadows and highlight slider in Lightroom or Photoshop. And I'm like, it's the same idea, except I'm using 4, 5, 6, 7 images, and you're trying to pull it all out of one. So as you look at this, you can see as we start to step up through the different exposures how more information is there. And this overexposed image is ensuring that those shadows and cracks have details, that they don't just go pure black. So when I merge these, which I'll do a little bit later, this is giving me all of that information that I need so that I get a good so that's kind of the idea there, and I just want to make sure everybody sort of understands why we might shoot HDR. Dan had a good question in the question thread saying, you know, hey, can you still use HDR with a graduated filter? And I think the answer is of course. You know, you might decide to use a grad filter to knock down the sky even more, but you know, the complexities there is that while you could do that, I think it's pretty easy to have more flexibility in post, and a lot of times what I don't like about the graduated filter is unless it's a clean landscape, if I've got things like architecture or buildings, I can get variations in exposure that might not be exactly what I want. So Ron, why don't you build off of this, and then we'll start with you with one of the first examples as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think the graduated filter question is, the answer is really that you can. If you do that, I would say make sure that you leave the filter in the same position. Like, don't try to bracket with while adjusting the filter, because I think I've been asked about that before. Make sure that all the source images are the same, and only the shutter speed changes. But the real answer is using bracketing and HDR and exposure fusion. These are supposed to be kind of replacements for things like filters and lighting, bringing in a bunch of lighting or using filters. You know, one of the drawbacks to the graduated you have to compose your image based on the filter, because that's kind of static item, where so that if your horizon is not in a place that the graduated filter is going to help very much, then you need to move the composition. Or if you have a very uneven horizon and things like that, those are the kind of the challenges with that. So using bracketing is supposed to be really a replacement for those kinds of things. So you can, but I think you should use really one or the other typically. You have a I think of HDR and bracketing as one tool in the toolbox, in the camera bag, in the digital camera bag, more or less.
Okay.
Complicated answer, like it always depends, right?
It's good. Yeah. Do you have a photo rolled up you want to share?
Yeah, sure. I can show you. Let's see. Just do my screen share. Oops.
And folks, while Ron is getting his screen up and running, remember there is the Q&A pod. If there's any questions that you'd like to ask, we'll make sure to take some of those, and then Mark, Ron, and I are all going to share some photos with you, telling you how we shot them, the approaches we made, and then we'll walk you through the different ways of using the software. So, Ron, your screen is live. Why don't you tell us what you're doing there?
Okay, I'm going to do what you just said already. Okay. So this is a I'll just bring up one of the single images. This is just an office space, and thought it was pretty important to show that you're looking your office, if you rent this, would be overlooking San Francisco, so they wanted to include the view, of course.
It's a great view, but those chairs have pretty much disappeared.
Yeah, exactly, and it's rather disappointing without the view, because it's an empty office at this point trying to be rented. So I took a lot of images to cover the dynamic range. That was 9 there, right? So we can go through them one at a time. That's probably really underexposed, probably wasn't necessary. But here you can see the view, and there's a dynamic range involved in the view as well. When you're shooting the view, it's not one shot to cover the dynamic range outside the window. There's also typically a pretty wide dynamic range out there as well. So I'm just going through to show the range of photos that I took, and I really purposely overexposed, which I think is important now with one of the processes that I use a lot that I'll show you. So in the interest of time, I have already converted them from RAW, because that's one of the longest processes in combining them. So I have them converted to JPEG already. So I'm going to drag them into Photomatix. I think we'll go over these dialogues quickly. They're basically just confirming the images. If I wanted to do alignment or remove ghosts or reduce noise or chromatic aberration, I'd do those here. But this kind of scene is really static, and those aren't necessary. I took it on a good solid tripod. I don't need to align them. I applied noise reduction and chromatic aberration during the RAW conversion, so those are already done. So I'm just going to merge them to HDR. It just takes a second to combine. It's creating a 32-bit that it'll show us in a moment. Okay, so it created the 32-bit image and went directly to a preview type mode. So right out of the gate, this is the Fusion real estate method, which actually I was going to show you second, but I had it open already apparently. So when you open Photomatix initially, you're going to see tone mapping. So tone mapping is the classic HDR type tool. It takes a 32-bit image, which is created from all those source images, and then works its magic. This is the kind of method you would use if you're pretty experienced with HDR and with post-processing, because you can do the most with it. You can also get those fake results that people love and hate, so you got to be careful with it. But it's also very, very possible to get really realistic results too, especially if you're going to do a little bit of post-processing later, just to bring back some of the contrast you tend to lose doing tone mapping. And the reason is that tone mapping, the whole purpose of it is to reduce contrast, to get your histogram, if you're a histogram-oriented person, is to bring it all into a viewable space. So when you reduce the contrast that much, you tend to lose it too much, and there's no blacks, no shadows left. So sometimes post-processing is necessary. But just with a couple of clicks, I think this looks pretty good. I think I would want to brighten up some of the white tables a little bit in post-processing. But what I wanted to show, too, is exposure fusion, which people tend to ignore. Maybe it's just sitting there up in the top left corner here. Might be a little small on the screen share. But if I switch to exposure fusion, which is one of the choices above the sliders, then you can choose a whole list of other options. Right here is Fusion Natural. I can just click the default, and it brings out a natural result really quite easily, quite automatically. You can also access it from presets over here. Stop me if I sound like I'm doing a sales demo. I'm just kind of trying to show what I do. But then there's a pretty new method called Fusion Real Estate, and the intended use of it is something like this, where there's an interior with a bright window. So it brings in the windows. It looks for those lost highlights. Excuse me. One of the drawbacks to exposure fusion in general is that it doesn't recover the highlights as well as tone mapping does. So Fusion Real Estate is kind of an answer for that. So it brings in that outdoor area quite quickly and easily.
Very cool.
Pardon me just a moment. Well, I muted myself while I coughed. So there's one interior example. I could show you also a interior. There's a hotel room, or let's use a dining room example here. I'm just going to grab. I know that I underexposed this because I looked at it. I've processed these before, of course. So here's a common real estate type situation. Going through the same dialogues as before.
So while you're getting that set, a question came in from Richard Moya about, we said that we could shoot with 2 stops apart. Ron, do you ever see any advantage of keeping it only 1 step apart, or even smaller? You know, do the tighter bracketing reduce the amount of noise? Because Photomatix doesn't really have a limit as to how many shots you can give it, right? It just adds time to the processing.
Yes, and you could run out of memory depending on your system, but the answer is it's highly debated. I've usually used 1-stop spacing because I mostly shoot with Nikon, and it allows you to take 9 images but only 1 space apart. And for most situations, 9 stops is enough. So I tend to do that. I've shot it more by using special equipment to use better, more open bracketing, but I don't personally. It's only a feeling, but I do feel like I get a little happier right away with the results with 1 spacing. But I don't know if that's. I've asked the engineers, and they said there's not really any technical reason to say that one is better than the other. But it's up to you. It's one of those things that it's really great to experiment with. Personally, exposure fusion, I like to use 1-stop spacing. Tone mapping in HDR, I don't think it matters, and because part of the HDR is that it creates a 32-bit image, and then it doesn't care about your source images anymore once that 32-bit image is created. Where exposure fusion is using the source images, so it's trying to take the best pixel from the source. It's trying to take the best pixel for each location from the best source image. So it does care about the source image, and giving it more, to me, seems natural that it would have more to choose from.
All right. Well, walk us through this image here and your thoughts behind it. Then I'll show one, and then Mark will toss over to you to take a look at one of your photos here.
Okay. Well, I guess what I would say for things like this, if you open it up and see in this one where the windows are not as big a part of the total image, they're small compared to the full image, and that's where. So the last image, since there was a lot of windows, exposure fusion, the old-fashioned way or the normal way or the natural way, could handle it better. But when the windows are a smaller portion of the overall scene, like this one, now see how they're much more blown out when I choose Fusion Natural. And I'm just using default settings, and I want to just make a point where I see a lot of people talk about, well, the default settings look good or bad. Well, the default settings are the default center. That's only the start. Where I should be able to do better with this image. However, I already know that Fusion Natural is going to be a little disappointing in regards to the bright highlights, the windows. So let's bring in Fusion Real Estate and look at that default setting. Shows our view much, much better. A little darker, so I'm just going to turn the shadows up a little bit. And I know that I will want to slightly brighten up some of the light areas in the scene in post, which I can either do in the next step in Photomatix or I can do in my post-processing application. So this is a good use for the real estate thing. This is the kind of thing that Mark and I have been talking about, how typically this interior 2 will bring really great results from a batch process where instead of spending a lot of time in combining all of these images, you would batch process all of these images and then spend a short amount of time doing a little tweak of a levels or a curve before the export.
Very cool. Very cool.
Ron, did you apply any noise reduction to that image or to either one of those samples that you showed us? And if so, when? Before?
No, knowing me, I would apply it during raw conversion.
Right. Okay. Yes.
So if you load your images, if you import all your images, excuse me, if you load all your source images into Lightroom, then if you're going to batch process, you can export them all, and I would apply noise reduction then. If you use the Lightroom plugin to export to Photomatix Pro, you can also do the same thing, and that's actually for any Lightroom users out there. When you going to use the export plugin, it's really recommend that you use the noise reduction here, because when you export, the first thing it's going to do is call on Lightroom to do the raw conversion to TIFF, and then it's going to combine it in Photomatix Pro, so you get kind of the benefit of the really good raw processor of Adobe Camera Raw and the benefit of the really good HDR processing of Photomatix. It's kind of best of both worlds.
Actually, and I've got an example of that queued up. Do you mind if I show that real quick, and then we'll toss to Mark? Okay. So hold on to that image that you got there. Let me just send this over real quick. Start screen share. And can you guys see Lightroom on my end?
Yes.
Okay. So I've got a bunch of images in here, and let's just take a series. We'll save the one with the moving crowd for a little later, but let's take this series of a hole in the wall, and I want to be able to show the dynamic range of all the things here. And we can do that, or actually here's a good one. We'll go back to that sort of that hallway with the window example. And so what I'll typically do is I'll develop the base exposure. And one of the things that's important is, and Ron, feel free to chime in, avoid making really too many changes here to highlights or shadows. You could do a minimal amount of changes, but you really don't need to do too much to the tonality here, because that's going to come from the merge, right?
Yeah, I can give you an insider tip there. When we're talking about HDR tone mapping, all of those in the basic sections should be 0.
Okay, and remember, folks, if they're not 0, you just double-click on a slider and it zeroes out. Or you can click the reset button and it should go back to default.
There you go. The exception is to go down to noise reduction, maybe lens correction is something I do in that step.
Yep.
Those things
so
they don't apply to the exposure level of the image. And then
so
there's the other
that.
part of that tip is that sorry, there's one more important part if you're going to, as part of that tip, is if you're going to use exposure fusion, those rules don't apply. Go ahead and what I like to do is do a little bit of highlight shadows, maybe bring down the blacks a little bit, that type of thing that you might normally do. That's okay if you're going to use exposure fusion. If you're not sure, then go with the zeros.
Okay, so I've zeroed that out for now. And with sharpening, you tend to bring it up a little bit, or where do you tend to leave it?
Which one, the sharpening?
Yeah.
0.
You zero out your sharpening?
Yeah, zero the sharpening when you do the export, and apply the sharpening afterward. This is capture sharpening, and it's
Sure.
really when you're exporting to Photomatix Pro, it's better to have no sharpening applied at that stage, and then do the sharpening at the end.
Okay. So we zeroed that out, and I'm going to zoom into 100% here so I can really see the image, but I will do a little bit of noise reduction. And on these sliders, if you hold down the Option or Alt key as you drag them, you actually get a nice black and white image, which makes it a little bit easier to see the noise reduction. So you can go in and check some of the key areas of the photo, see if you have any noise problems. This was shot on a GH4, so the sensor is not enormous. But you did mention, and I'm a huge fan of using the lens corrections. Now, with these lens corrections, the basic category, you can enable this. With Micro Four Thirds, it might already have a profile built in. Or, so if you turn that on and it doesn't show a profile, or it might already say interior profile already applied. So don't be surprised if it doesn't show up, or you can go in and make a profile with the tool. But I still like the upright adjustments here. For example, the ability to sort of zero that out. So you see how it just fixed the slight off-angle nature. Or I could say fix the vertical, or level the photo, or do a more dramatic. And so once that's all done, if you have done any sharpening or you have done any changes, select everything for that whole image. I'll often press Command-G to group that into a stack. It makes it easier if you just stack those images together to sort of keep them organized. But sync them and tell it to sync everything across. So that's all done the exact same way. So it's important that you do that sync. And if you were in something like Bridge, same idea. You can go in and make sure that that is synced. Let me just pull up. I just had it open. Let me just grab a couple of images here. And what I'm going to do is select all of those, open in Camera Raw, and look at that base image. Set that back to 0. There's the Basic tab. Go to the Detail tab. Ron's suggesting turning sharpening off, but feel free to pull down some of the noise a little. And remember, you could take advantage of upright to fix issues with the photo, like I did there. There I did a balanced adjustment, and you see how it fixed that hallway and some of the angles to give me cleaner lines. Select everything and choose Synchronize. And just make sure when you sync, you also need to click Sync here under Lens Corrections to apply the same to everything. And then you would just save out those images. Was there something you wanted to add, Ron?
Oh yeah, I was going to say I've got questions over the years a few times when someone said, "Hey, my images won't align."
Yeah.
And it was a big mystery until finally, and I made the mistake too, is that the lens correction was not applied to all of the images, probably accidentally, like they didn't get synced, or they didn't, like the mistake I made is I think I just didn't select them all the right way or something like that. But that ended up being...
In Camera Raw, if you don't click Sync Results under Lens Corrections, it won't sync properly. Although Lightroom, it does with the sync button. So there's a gotcha for you.
Yeah, I've managed to make that mistake somehow, and sometimes when we just couldn't figure out why something wouldn't align until finally I got the images and they were just a little bit different due to the lens corrections.
Just enough, right?
Yeah.
So when you have that all set, then that's where you would just do your export. So I could either export these and save off high quality TIFFs, or I can save off and do your merge there, right? And just choose that from my export module. And are you a fan of any particular color space? I find myself using ProPhoto a bit, but do you have any insider information there as to what works better? I'm assuming you're not going to say sRGB.
No, I think sRGB is something you might convert.
S stands for suck, by the way.
What's that?
S stands for suck, doesn't it?
Well, I think it stands for lowest common denominator, doesn't it?
Okay.
No, I think sRGB, that's something I might convert it to sRGB around the same time as I do my sharpening as the final step, because if it's going to go out for web, then at that point you want it to be sRGB. While you're working, personally, I pretty much stick to Adobe RGB, but I don't want to tell anyone to do one or the other because it really depends on them. So I don't really want to. These are one of those things where it's just what you prefer. And if you I think Pro Photo is more future proofing at this point, but
yeah,
people disagree.
Lightroom particularly actually recommends sticking with Pro Photo for its exports. It's going to better preserve the color you saw in Lightroom in other applications. So I'm going to go with Pro Photo in 16-bit, and when I hit export, in this case, you turned me onto this, Ron. If you shot from a tripod and you know that the images should be aligned, you don't necessarily need to align images. But why is there a choice for tripod versus handheld? Is handheld basically just saying try harder?
Yeah. Well, alignment is still needed sometimes on a tripod. There can still be very small movements, and so it would just make sure the registered properly. The tripod method is very, very simple. It's very, very fast as well. So it's a good to use if you're in a quick workflow and you've used a tripod. The handheld one has a lot more factors involved, like rotation of the camera and shift and things. So it's really going to look for a lot more alignment issues. So if you're
more 3D alignment versus just subtle side-to-side shake, right?
Right. It even says there it takes perspective into account and everything. So it's really powerful. And at this point, the handheld alignment is supposed to work all the time. So if anybody gets anything that doesn't align using handheld, let us know and send it to us so our engineers can kind of improve that. Okay. But it's supposed to work in all the cases. And also, in any time that the tripod method, if for some reason it doesn't work, just use the handheld method, even if you used a tripod and there was more movement, maybe got kicked or something like that. Don't be afraid to use handheld anytime that there's any.
I was only half joking, but try harder really does mean try harder. It's more aggressive and it tries harder to fix the alignment, right?
Yeah, how about do more? Yeah.
Okay, do more.
do better.
No need to reduce noise here necessarily because we already did that in Lightroom, right? So I can uncheck that and save some time.
Yeah. If you've done it in Lightroom, yeah.
So we'll do the merge here, and it's going to export those photos and hand them off. And this was one of those examples. Go ahead.
You're merging to 32-bit, so that plugin merges it and puts the 32-bit file back into Lightroom.
And I did that on purpose. Why would I bring the 32-bit image into Lightroom?
So that you can use the develop module to tone map it.
Yeah, which is kind of cool, because there was a question that popped up, and I can't comment too much on it, but somebody was asking about, will Lightroom 6 and this and that, and I can't comment on rumors because I'm not allowed to, but I still like having a 32-bit workflow sometimes. I see a benefit to bringing in a 32-bit image, and so it's going to create that file and hand it back off, and that does give me some extra flexibility with that 32-bit image once it comes back into my library here to actually work with that file and do some additional manipulations. Now, otherwise, we can hand those off. I'll go from Bridge here, and I'll just do a simple right-click and say, Open with Photomatix Pro. And this is going to allow me to bring all of those in. I did not do my RAW conversion first, but it's going to just use your own RAW processor. I know that you guys do recommend that if you don't want to use the Photomatix RAW processor, that using Adobe or your camera's RAW processor is a good idea. But I do find that you do a pretty good job nonetheless. So, just for comparison's sakes for time, you see it is decoding those RAW files there. And while it's not as fast as giving it RAWs or TIFFs, I got to tell you, Ron, just from a space-saving point of view, if I'm doing a big panoramic job or particularly a time-lapse job where I've got all of these files, I'm often avoiding that interim step of making files that I intend to merge, and I'll just merge directly with yours. It does work.
Oh yeah, there's the RAW processor is the reason that I like to use the ACR is really that what doesn't happen in the Photomatix RAW processor is lens correction, and the noise reduction is as I understand it anyway, is kind of after the RAW process. So and noise reduction is best done during the RAW conversion. So those are the kind of the reasons I use it. But by all
Sure.
means, a lot of people are very happy with the raw processor. I do that too. There's no reason that you shouldn't use it. It's there for you. It's powerful.
So there's that exposure fusion real estate. It took all of those 7 exposures, merged them into one, and this does give me a lot of flexibility on that image. I mean, did a nice job. This is from an urban exploration project. This was Corridor in the Philippines, which is an old bombed out military shelter, right? So, I mean, I was able to pull quite a bit of detail there by merging those shots together and fusing them.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So now, and I love that you have these categories here, like realistic. And I spent a lot of time in the realistic category.
You didn't have to bring in a bunch of lighting to get that shot.
I couldn't bring in a bunch of lighting. This is a bombed out thing that I wasn't supposed to be in the first place. So now I apply this, but you mentioned, having lens corrections in Camera Raw and all of that. That's true, but one of the things I love is that Camera Raw is a filter in Photoshop. So after this has been merged and I've created my file here, with this bridge workflow, you have your own finishing touches, right? Like we can sharpen here if we want. We can do all of that. But for giggles, watch this. I'm just going to save this, File, Save As, and I'm going to choose right at the bottom to open this in Photoshop as soon as it's saved. So it saves it, hands it off to Photoshop, and I'm just going to say, okay, let's make that for smart filters. And look, here we go. We've got the ability now to run lens correction, same thing as in Camera Raw. You could pick your lens, your model, everything else, or you can do all of the custom corrections right there. You can do Camera Raw as a filter, so if I want to go in and do that sharpening there, and let's just option drag the masking slider so we better define the edges. There we go. So I sharpen the edges nicely. And there's the lens thing, and look, I can apply upright after the fact on the image after the merge to get that stuff where I want it to be. So that looks better now. Things are a little more level, and I can apply the crop or any of that. I'll click OK to generate that, and it did the fix. And again, while you're in there, you do have all of those same adjustments. So if I want to use the on-image tool here for HSL, I could say, you know what, saturate that hallway a little bit more and pull down the saturation there and make this area a little darker and roll the hue. And so you have all those same controls that you did in Lightroom after the merge. So you just have to go through Photoshop, which is kind of fun. And that gives you that flexibility. So let's just put a little dip in the exposure from the bottom.
It's about 6 ways to do everything nowadays, isn't there?
There always is, but my favorite reason to go through here is that adaptive wide angle. And you guys know I'm a sucker for this one.
Yeah.
This allows you to draw lines that should be straight. And so this curvature that I didn't want is now gone. And I have forced these to be straight lines. And so you see how they're even after I did the correction. And you can even draw a box. So I can go right here and draw a box on this hallway and then shift-click on each one of these lines to force that into a true box. And you see that's kind of cool, and you can do all sorts of fixes. And so I just love this flexibility that you have after the fact. And when you shift-click on those lines, you'll notice that they start to go vertical or perpendicular. So it's amazing what you can fix inside of the image. And I'd have to go in and do this one, but still, all that flexibility exists after the fact, so you can dramatically start to move things around. So that's just
for interiors.
There's and so
inevitably an not completely straight wall or straight line somewhere.
Yeah, the adaptive wide angle tool is just awesome, folks. And all you have to do is just draw a line, and then if you shift-click on that line, it forces it to be vertical or horizontal. And if it's red, it's telling you, I think it's close, and you just manually drag it a little bit until it goes green. And yeah, I mean, I just totally manhandled all of those lines and force this image to be straight. And so I love having that. But again, different ways of working. But I just love how that natural method of exposure fusion brought out all of that detail. Like if you look at the amount of information in that photo versus what I would have gotten with a single exposure, it's just breathtaking what you can do as you start to combine those brackets together. So this was just me on a lightweight tripod auto bracketing with the GH4 on a micro four thirds sensor, which is not known for its low light sensitivity.
Right.
All right. That's my example of putting those pieces together. Let me stop screen sharing.
Yeah.
Mark, you got an example queued up, or Ron, you got some questions or comments?
Actually, I just while you were talking, I found the question section on the Hangout. So apologies for being I'm like a sophomore on these Hangouts, so I can bang out.
This is your second or third Hangout, right?
Something like that. I've done a couple of them, but I can answer a couple of these questions because they're kind of in my wheelhouse.
Sure, and then we'll toss over to Mark.
Okay, like I think I'm going to go backwards. I'm pretty sure he was asking why do these let's see, Dan was asking, right? Why do these adjustments on multiple photos when you can do it in post? And the answer is you don't have to do it either way. And okay, opinion time over here. Okay.
I was going to say, if you have a noisy shot, when you merge together 6 noisy shots, you have a really noisy shot, right?
Well, yeah. If you have noise, well, the main reason I was going to say is that a lot of these adjustments are best done during a RAW conversion, from what things I've read. So the best point to add noise reduction would be then. Plus, like the things that Rich was just showing, if you use lens correction during that process, it would be 99. I don't know, 100% there or 90% there, so there'd be a lot less to do at that point, and it does it more automatically if you use the lens profiles and things. So there's some benefits to doing it in those steps. You don't have to though, because maybe you realize that you've got a winner after you've already put it together and you don't want to go back. So by all means, there's all those other tools. So I don't want to tell people to do it in any particular way, and when I do, I usually try to say I like to do it this way or I prefer or whatever. So don't think that I'm telling you have to do it one way. It sounds like you're saying to pre-process before going to Photomatix rather than just taking the RAW into Photomatix. Yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about. Again, I do that a lot. It depends on the kind of work I'm doing. So if it's an interior, I like to get those lens corrections out of the way, even though I have great lenses, but they're so wide, they still end up having a little bit of not completely straight lines, and so I like to handle that at that step. And once you do it a few times and you use that syncing capability in either Bridge or Lightroom or really other processors that I've played with in the past, they tend to be pretty easy once you've done it a couple times. It's easy to synchronize those, so it's really not a lot of work to do that way. What else? Recently, I'm having trouble telling who's asking. I guess Robert Croy. Recently, I've seen some portrait photos that look like they were done in HDR. Did you talk about using HDR with portraits? Well, what I'd like to do is find the link to. There's someone. Most portrait work I've seen with HDR, the HDR is applied to the backgrounds more than the person. So they're creating some really awesome custom backgrounds, and then they're putting like I can't come up with a name. There's somebody that's really great at it. I'll try to find it while someone else is talking and add a link. But he does some really great sports photography and uses his own pre-created backgrounds that are really impressive. Of course, with portraits, you get into movement, so I don't know if it's not something I've done, so I guess I can't give you too much about it. I know it brings out all the detail for better and for worse. If you want if you want a shot of somebody with all the great wrinkles and crags and things, then tone mapping even a single image can bring some of that out. So I know some people have done that. Any other questions you guys saw that were good ones? Ron, why is it better to zero capture sharpening? Why is it better to zero capture sharpening out before exporting to Photomatix? That answer I have to just give as that's what the engineers say that Photomatix wants. that creates the image. So that's all I've got for you there. The experts say that. The other one's about Lightroom.
Ron, was that last question on sharpening?
Yeah, on the capture sharpening. You
definitely want to zero those things out, folks, because you're going to end up sharpening all the noise that's in the image. You want to, if you're going to do it with a sharpening, you want to take care of noise reduction first, and go ahead and take care of lens corrections while you're there, if possible. Just like both Ron and Rich both just showed details of. I'm sorry to interrupt, Ron. Go right ahead. But yes, that is fine. That's my experience. I'll sharpen all the noise if I sharpen that. Now I'll wait. Sharpening is last. It depends on what size you want to fulfill. You know, what is your client looking for? Are you going big, small? You know, all this is a determination in my experience when it comes to how much noise reduction to apply, and I'm still learning how to do that. So I'm sorry to interrupt, Ron. Go right ahead.
No, that's good. And I think all of these things apply to just giving the best source images to work with. You know, like my dad would say, garbage in, garbage out. You know, you want to start with the best you can, and again, a lot of those things are just best done during raw processing. So again, that's just my recommendation.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree.
That's all the questions I have on my screen. Let's see. I guess I can go ahead. I'm playing with the questions over here. If I find some more, I'll chime in.
Okay. Rich, you still with us? See a photo focus.
It's just you and me, Mark. All right, more questions.
Well, hey, just to reiterate about the real estate, the exposure fusion versus tone mapping and things like this. Ron, could you reiterate just a little bit when to go with exposure fusion exactly? You and I were discussing this, and I'm still trying to get my mind around how do I know when I want to go with exposure fusion exactly? When I have much pre-processing to do as far as noise reduction, or if I have a good clean set of shots, a good clean set of brackets that I don't need a lot of noise reduction and lens correction on, would you recommend just a straight tone map, or would you recommend to go into an exposure fusion?
Well, let me answer that first by just going back a little bit with what exposure fusion actually is. So anybody that's spent time in the past doing what y'all used to do, which is to take a couple different images to cover dynamic range and then layer them in Photoshop and paint in and out what the areas you want and don't want. Exposure fusion is a lot like that in a more automated way. So it's still trying to take images just as if they'd been layered and try to pull the best parts from the source images. So it's actually kind of a simple process as far as getting our heads around it. And one of the benefits is that it's just easy to get natural results quite easily. It's much easier to just extend your dynamic range by throwing it through exposure fusion and compared to doing the tone mapping. So that's one of the big benefits to it. And another benefit is that it has a natural side effect of noise reduction. So I use it for a lot of nighttime shots. I'll even take if I don't even take multiple shots at the same exposure and run it through exposure fusion, because noise is random. So the noise in those underexposed nighttime shots is going to get sort of naturally removed just by combining them. So that's kind of a little tricky trick I've done before. But if you're in a noise situation, and those of us shooting with Micro Four Thirds cameras are seeing it more and more and more, that's one of the good reasons to more better answer when you would want to do one or the other. I think that things like real estate is a really great situation for focusing on exposure fusion, kind of for the reasons that I was saying before. But if you have experience at it and you're ready to spend a little bit more time on the photo, then tone mapping actually is the best at recovering the most highlights and the most shadows and giving the most options.
Why don't we toss to Mark for a second?
So if you're
Mark, sorry, there. Finish your thought, Ron. You cut out for a second there.
Oh, I'm sorry. it's just gonna say if you're comfortable with tone mapping, then you can get more out of it ultimately, but it just takes an extra step for me. And from my experience, to get good realistic results, it takes an extra step of post-processing. So that's so if you're doing a lot of work that you don't have a lot of time to put in, like on real estate, where you're not, the jobs are many, you got to really use a lot of automatic processes. That's a really good reason to, because you get either all the way there or just almost all the way there just with a batch process of exposure fusion. So that's a good reason to do that. Where tone mapping, you need to spend more time with individual shots.
Right.
All right, Mark, why don't you show us an example and give a couple tips, and then we'll wrap up for the day.
Sure. Yeah, no problem, Rich. Here, I have Lightroom with me here. If I'll get that open up if you want to switch over to me.
You are live. Just on the left-hand side, click the screen share button. Just put your mouse over the left edge of the screen, and you'll see a little green screen with a white arrow on it, and that'll turn on screen share.
Very good.
Click on that and share your screen.
There we go. Okay, do we have Lightroom?
Switch to Lightroom. You've got your Google Plus window in front of it.
I see Rich on your screen.
I will get rid of that then.
Click on screen share, and then just choose your desktop, and then switch to Lightroom.
I have Lightroom open here. You guys can't see it, huh?
When you click screen share, you have to choose Lightroom or desktop from a pop-up window.
With you. Rookie activity here, folks. Bear with me. Okay, full screen. I don't see Lightroom in my options.
Okay, just choose desktop and then switch to Lightroom.
This is crazy, Rich, but I don't see a desktop. There's no desktop option. It's just, I'm going to see if this works.
Now bring up Lightroom instead of the web browser. There you go.
Gotcha.
Yep.
It's working. Okay. Now, this is an example. This is a shot that we will see on every MLS. A boring front door shot that has to be in every set, every group for a real estate shot, and it always UFOs. There's, depending on how bright, what time of the day that we're shooting. This is a single raw file, very mediocre. It's halfway straight. Here is our final result, which is not a ton better, but you can see the UFOing is gone. I wanted to use this example not because it's so great, but just because it is a common shot that you will have in every real estate job, and it almost always looks the worst in every lineup of images. So from here, very flat. The shadow highlight. We have a wide dynamic range here. Now this is a single image exposure fused through Photomatix shot, and you can see. Take a look over to the right where the bookcase is. You can see the detail that's come out in the woodwork. This comes out really well, or even in the floor, or the banister, or the door itself. You can see my flash. I was in a bad position with my flash, but for the most part, we have a very level, even shot here, and this happens to really make short work of a shot that's usually very hard to get. Another example.
I think wood is a good
windows in an alcove. Beg pardon?
Or sorry, I was just going to say.
Wood is really here's our
details.
Here's a single image exposure fusion of this image. Again, this is with the real estate interior, and I don't have I don't have the ability to do a screen grab of this right now. Ron, you and I can cover this down the road, and I'll cover this in my post that I'll put up this week, Rich, as well. But the detail that comes out in this, and the way that it takes the UFO effect, or at least subdues the background and the lighting, it brings out the detail and any woodwork or anything interesting about the property or the room at all. Moving on to a kitchen. Again, these are all single images, just to show you, because one of those ones that'll be a crank in, crank out scenario, tripod, moving from spot to spot, grabbing a shot. It used to be something that I would grab 3, 4, 5, 6 shots of in the past. Now I don't have to. I can just get this shot and then create a little bit more of a balanced look. Again, your preference when it comes to your creative expression and how you want to do this. I almost never really know where I want to go except as natural as I can, and sometimes I end up completely on the opposite end of the spectrum. But you know, in a case like this with a room, a straightforward room, it'll really do just wonders for quickness as far as being able to balance out a scene. Here we go. We have some UFOing lights over on the right from these windows. A fairly wide dynamic range in the shot. Again, these are all these are just the initial what Photomatix gave me. No other post processing after to razor lift shadows and highlights. There's some work in here.
Can you show that process? Do you have a raw file that you can open and show them how you invoke that?
Let me see here. I have a trial version of Photomatix loaded on here. Let me go ahead and open that and do that.
You had to switch in your defense. You had to switch to a different computer. So you get that open. I have one loaded really quick, and then we'll show yours. So what he's doing there, folks, if you can see my screen here, let me just hit share. So we're being rookie to go. Start my screen share. So he took a single file into Photomatix. So if I just reveal this and drag this single exposure, because maybe that's all I have into Photomatix, when you bring that in, what happens is it gives you the option to actually fuse it. So I could say, oh, okay, enable exposure fusion on this single photo. And so it converts the raw file, opens it up, and it actually, I find it to be sort of a super version of like the shadows, highlights, and clarity slider in Lightroom. It's going to give me so much more information. So here's what Lightroom saw, or Bridge saw, with that one photo. And this is what Photomatix saw in that single photo. This is one shot. So I'm able to, you know, either do exposure fusion here, which is quite nice, and recover some of the highlights and lift the shadows and put in some contrast in situation. And there's just so much more information there. That's Lightroom. That's from the GH4.
GH4 so from a Micro Four Thirds camera. Wow.
All that information was in there. Plus, we can use these great presets from the realistic category. I mean, just look at that photo. That's a single raw photo processed with Photomatix. And it's just great how you can go in and pull out more information out of the shadows and highlights. So
yeah, what you did there, Rich, for everybody, is that it's very, very much like a common process people do. Is you take a single raw photo and you adjust it in a raw processor and you save it. Like you adjust it as up one stop or down one stop or both, and then you save them as 3 separate ones and then load them in there. It's very much like doing that.
But I think that, I mean, just for the records, while I love Micro Four Thirds cameras, this sensor is, you know, about 1/3 of the size of a full frame sensor. Yeah. That's a lot of information pulled out of a single raw photo there.
Yeah, that's why I was surprised. I saw the ORF up above, and that's why I was surprised. That's why I asked.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of info there. And so even if you haven't shot bracketed, I just love, I mean, this is the realistic version here. And look at how much information is in the shadows and highlights versus that. Yeah, so, Mark, I know you were loading something up. You were on you had to switch to a different computer, so I'm not sure if you had your files loaded. But do you have something that you can show us raw?
I have, yeah, I think I have something, Rich, if you want to switch back over.
Yep, we're on you.
Got me? Okay.
Yep.
Here I am on this on the raw file. Actually, it's a you know what, Rich? I saved these off as JPEGs to save space. Let me see. Let's see what'll happen. I'm going to open just the JPEG version, just in case you happen to be shooting JPEG and not RAW, for curiosity, to see what might happen. Did that wrong? There we go. Let's go over to. Actually, we won't be able to because we can't do the the exposure fusion. I don't think the option won't be available to us, Ron.
Correct.
I think.
Correct.
We're just going to be tone mapping at this point. So it's just kind of moot. I apologize, Rich. I don't have raw files with me. I only have JPEGs for simplicity's sake. I apologize. Actually, hold on a second.
Okay.
Maybe I do. Let me double check that. I very well know. Some help I was here. Apologize for that. But yes, I did want you to see examples, and I want folks out there that are interested in real estate photography to see that the process is really friendly to you as far as your workflow and getting yourself in position. See, these are JPEGs. I didn't do RAWs, Rich, and I apologize.
No problem. That's okay. It's a good workflow. I've got the second example, and then if you want to queue up one more example, we've got time for that.
Yeah.
And then we'll end up with Ron. But let me just give everybody that so you see it clearly what we're talking about. So, a lot of folks say, well, I don't want to shoot HDR, I'm not used to it, or I don't see a benefit in doing this because, this is new to me. So here's a raw photo, just a landscape. This is the base exposure. It's nothing great, but it's not. It had a nice dynamic range, and I just take that raw file right in, and I'm going to say Enable Exposure Fusion, and I click OK, and it's going to hand that raw file off. And what it give me is sort of what Ron was alluding to. It's essentially, I would liken it to some of the old ways of being able to work. Now, that's interesting. Oh, the color conversion. I didn't like the Pro Photo there. I know what that did. 1 second. Let's do this one. So we'll just take that in, and I'll stick with Adobe RGB for right now. And it's going to give me a lot of information off of that single raw file. So it sees the shadows, it sees the highlights, and it would be almost like developing it multiple times and then gently masking it out. So, here's the out of the camera image. That's the base exposure of what the camera saw when I metered and said, give me a properly exposed image. And I just love using these categories. Let's go with the realistic category. Actually, let's talk about black and white for a moment. Love doing black and white conversions with these off of a single raw file. Look at all of these dramatically different black and whites off of that single file, including the ability to sort of relight it afterwards. I love how you guys go in and can create different types of lighting on that image. Particularly, I love it here on the black and white. There's a really boosted light versus a soft, natural light. That's really kind of cool how you can relight that for drama and then smooth out your highlights and tweak the gamma until you've got that perfect black and white conversion. A lot of fun. But besides as a fun black and white tool, I just love that realistic category. This takes all of the best realistic presets, puts them together, and I got to tell you, just look at that simple photographic one there. Looks great. Pop the saturation a little bit and hit apply, and let's just put those two side by side for comparison's sake. There's the one, right? So looks fine. And there's the original. So, if you take a look at those two, that's a big difference off of one raw file. So even if you haven't changed your shooting style yet, there's a whole bunch that Photomatix can do to really bring a lot out of those raw photos as far as exposure fusion. All right, who wants to go next?
Rich, let me show you. Let me show one more quick example. If you could click over to me, and then we'll leave off with Ron here.
Yep.
And I need to share my screen. Okay, you have me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Here is a simple. Here's a. Let me jump back over to the real estate real quick. I'll just brush through these. Here is a shot again that you encounter. Lamps are lit, dark, bright, wide range of dynamic range here. So this is a single image exposure fusion. It's a bit, you know, but the detail is incredible. The difference between these two images is night and day. This particular client loves the shot. They love the detail. They love the look. They feel like it really brought in all of the old school charm from the woodwork and the light work and the shadows and everything. They loved it. And this is a 1, 2, 3, 4 shot exposure in the opposite direction. Again, very rich results. These are things that are absolutely impossible to do without hours and hours of playing with these images in post. And one more, as I was explaining to Ron, one of my favorite things to use exposure fusion for on a single image is water. This is a recent image. It's a bit much. It's really heavy in detail, but images like this printed out in their final form, in all of their color, look very nice. They work very well. They don't necessarily, they're deceiving to look at in a digital format. They only really shine when they hit the wall. So that's something to keep in mind as well, that while these things might look cooked to our eyes while we're looking at them on our screen, its original proportion will also, is to be kept in mind, because they really are appealing in the print world as well. We have a few in our home, and Shootproof sent us a nice metal print of an HDR image, and just beautiful. You really can't beat using this process if you are seeking to get the most out of an image, especially a single image, but even more so on multiple images. So I'll just leave it off with that. And Ron, you and I can pick up some. I know Ron and I are going to work on a couple of things, a couple of projects down the road here, trying to dial this in. So we'll get more samples and examples to folks, and I'll cover these in a few posts as well. So it really is an amazing tool, especially when you enter in the batch routines into it. It really simplifies the process, and I'll get more into that in my posts as well. Richard.
Good. Well, so a couple things, folks. We're going to do a follow-up hangout in a couple of weeks, where we have more bandwidth, and we'll call today our dress rehearsal. We had a couple of technical problems. I appreciate everybody hanging in there with us. This has been some great questions, and we have had a couple of HDR Hangouts in the past, too, so you can check out some of those, but we will be doing a follow-up one with some focus. I think I'd love to. There's going to be some interesting things to talk about in a few weeks, and we'll dig deeper into the workflow between Adobe products and Photomatix, and be able to show you guys how to put that all together. Ron, there was a lot of questions left. I don't think we can get through all of them, but do you have one more image you'd like to share with us, Ron, and maybe just give us some closing advice on workflow?
Sure. One closing thing I can like to say too is, if you have questions that we didn't get to answer, you're welcome to write to support@HDRsoft.com, and a lot of the times I'm the one to answer those, especially if they're photography related. So you can even address it to me if you want to, but that's always open to anyone. And I can show another interior. I've got a hotel one. I can show something that's close to my heart as a panoramic challenge if someone's interested there.
While you're bringing that up, Ron, I would point folks to the HDRsoft.com FAQ page if you really want to learn about the details, the ins and outs of how to put together your exposures and to calculate them properly. I highly recommend. If you have any questions at all regarding HDR and how to approach it, don't leave out the HDRsoft FAQ resource. It is second to none as far as the information I've been able to find in one setting. So highly recommend that as well.
A lot of the stuff we've been talking about shooting initially when we got together today, a lot of that is very detailed on the FAQ page, and it's really worth the half an hour or so that it would take to read through that. Highly recommend it. Just HDRsoft.com, click on support, and there's a FAQ link there. I can show really quickly the big challenge for me is what you're looking at there is a 360-degree photo, which is just impossible. Try to light that, because the lighting will all be in the scene, and it's impossible. There's a view outside. There's a dark areas across the room. So I captured it with a really wide range. So it's very bright for the dark areas, and then the opposite for the other areas. And
Ron, do you prefer to stitch your panoramas together before you do the HDR merge? I'm of a fan of merging my HDRs and then making my pano, but I think you do the other way. And we lost Ron. This has just been a lovely technical hangout. All right, well, hopefully he'll come back. Let me know when you're back, Ron. But we have had all sorts of fun technology-wise. Ron, are you back? There we go.
oh, did I get taken away again?
You did. I was just asking if you were merging panos and then making HDR or going the other way.
Well, before I got to this point, I took all of my bracketed. What I kind of showed quickly is I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 separate panoramas, each one at a different shutter speed. So there's one of the panoramas at a faster shutter speed. Here's an example of one of the panoramas at a slower shutter speed. So I end up getting what they call blend planes in the stitching software that I use, but that's prior to this step. So if I want to use the Photomatix tools, then I can still combine them after they've already been stitched. So here I've got one. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Now I have one panorama that's I applied exposure fusion to it. Even better, I can use real estate, and now I've got the exterior and the interior that's pretty well. Even with a couple of clicks, my histogram shows there's just a little bit of clipping at the edges. So with a couple of touches, I can bring that back in. And frankly, I want a little bit of clipping in the dark areas. That's just my style because I want some blacks to be here. And it also includes the very bottom where I have my tripod that's actually in view since it's a 360. But that's one of the uses, one of the really big uses that brought HDR into the world of photography when it used to be in 3D is the push from panoramic photographers looking for a tool like this. And now it's grown so much that we can use it for many different kinds of photography. So I just wanted to show that that's kind of the area that I use it for the most, and it's the widest dynamic range. It's the most challenging. I got to remember to click this 360-degree image so that the right and the left side and the top don't have a seam when they're put together when you look at it interactively. Because what you'll
right, because folks, this is going to be turned into an interactive movie that the person on the website could pan around and look and zoom, and it's really for virtual tours and such, correct, Ron?
Right, that's right. Yeah, it's
you're loading up as an example now to show people. Yeah, so this is a fun area of photography. I've been actually doing a lot of VR tours. I'll let that queue up for a little bit while Ron's getting that loaded on his end. Two things as we wrap up here, and then we're going to jump back to Ron's page. First off, we mentioned that you check out the FAQ page over at HDRsoft.com. That's a great page. There's also an HDR Learning Center over on Photomatix, that covers a lot of Photomatix stuff over at photofocus.com. So be sure to visit that. We've got a ton of articles. We weren't able to get to all the questions today. We're going to save those as we put together our agenda for the next issue. But here's the photo, Ron showing you some of his tours there, and you can see as he moves around that you can see in the environment, and this is great. So if you were wondering why all those straight lines were creating sort of like rainbow arcs, it's because they get reconnected in an environment like this to create these virtual tours. So you have seen some very interesting ramifications here for the real estate industry or the hospitality industry where people can go and explore. And on each one of those dots, when he clicks, it can jump you to another photo. So a whole bunch of cool stuff here that can be done in the world of photography. Ron, anything else you want to add as we sort of wind down right now?
Well, I think we've been on pretty long, so I imagine people are wanting to get away. But again, thanks, Mark, for bringing up the FAQs. I love to recommend that because when I started with HDR, before I ever had any involvement with HDRsoft, that's where I learned what to do. I went out, made all the mistakes, was frustrated. Then I went and I read the FAQs for about an afternoon probably because I really knew nothing. and then I really kind of hit the ground running once I went out and shot again, and I followed the recommendations there. So I highly, highly recommend doing that.
Awesome.
Very
Yeah.
cool. Very cool. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for both joining us today, and we'll be putting another one of these together for a few weeks out. We enjoy having all you guys who came out and watched this live. It'll also be available after the fact over on YouTube. And continue to post some questions on the event page. We'll use that to put together the agenda for the next one. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and thanks to our guests for being here today.